Manager for CONCAN, Connecticut Campaign for Achievement Now, and I'm joined with Executive Director Sabira Gordon. I am grateful to be here. I want to just give a shout out to my alma mater. I graduated from Norwalk High School, shared a nice unknown fact that I was a cheerleader my sophomore year and junior year, and drum major my senior year, Norwalk High School marching band with Jeff Smith. I was fortunate and honored to start with CONCAN in 2015 and starting a new territory, Fairfield County in Norwalk, where we have a remote office in South Norwalk. And just started there with our community engagement team, organizing and connecting with educators, parents, families, and students to advance education equity, and also to make sure that their voices were heard and to support and equip them to advocate for change in their community. We're here today by the honor and invitation of Superintendent Estrella. Grateful to have her on board and grateful to learn more about the work around framing an equity lens at a district level and the continuous work with Dr. Fergus. I also want to acknowledge friends that I see around the table and in the staff. Some are new that I've introduced myself to, but the Norwalk Board of Ed, I just want to say hello, and it's great to see Barbara, great to meet you, Diana, Heidi, Godfrey, Michael, and Colin. And so we're just going to give a quick overview about our Norwalk data and what we do as an organization on a policy and local level. And we're going to have a few moments for questions at the end, and Sabira and I are going to facilitate that conversation from a distance. We shared both of our documents, our 2020 updated policy goals, of which were updated after COVID, and also shared the Norwalk data deck with you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. I didn't think about this. Okay. I think I can make this happen. Hi everyone, Sabira Gordon, as Tony said, the Executive Director of CONCAN. I've been with CONCAN now for about 2 years, close to 2 years, and before that I worked at the legislature for about 8 years and did a lot of work around advancing equity, from criminal justice reform to housing inequity to doing work in the education space, specifically around looking at chronic absenteeism and looking at future diversity and how can we as a state advance some of those issues and ensure that students of color and not of color have role models in the classroom that are diverse. So we sent out the data to you. Norwalk, like many other places in our state, is not where it should be. I think the numbers say that about 18% of your teachers are teachers of color, while a large percentage of your students are students of color. So our goal is to try to get those numbers to balance out a little bit more and be a little bit more even. So what I will say is, COVID happened and our worlds became turned upside down in the education space. And I've been working in educational advocacy, as I said, for a few years now. And what we saw was high resource districts with lots of money were able to figure out how to quickly turn things around, get every kid an iPad, and make sure that they were able to kind of transform their learning. Not everyone did it well, but many of them had the resources to do that. And we saw where cities, it was a little bit of a different situation. Parents are coming to the table with lots of different resource challenges, and we saw that, educational equity, we've known all these things to have existed and to be true, that Connecticut has the largest opportunity and resource gap in the country, but we also saw that the needs became front and center for many of those who are not in this space. You're in the space and living it every day, so you kind of know what the numbers say. But I look at this as an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to do things right, and it's an opportunity to figure out how can we connect with students and make sure that we're leading with equity. We're making the decisions that are right for students and not the decisions that are right for what happened before. I've been doing a lot of research about kind of public school and how public school is starting in the United States. And we now have an opportunity to do things in the way that best suits the students that are sitting in the seats right now, not the students who are sitting in the seats when public school was created. So our policy goals are kind of centered in that. We really believe that, you know, there has to be high expectations of students, and there needs to be equity in whatever we end up doing, whether we're in a hybrid model, whether students are learning from home, whether they're in a classroom. We need to make sure that things are done in a way that preserves equity and students of color have access to high quality teaching and learning, not just kind of, you know, I saw a lot of districts, I wouldn't say this in Norwalk, but a lot of districts that gave parents a list of websites and said, here, go forth and do well. And that's not what we're looking at. When we're looking at distance learning, we want students to be engaged with teachers. We want them to have the tools that they need to be successful. We're also very interested in funding, right? School funding is one of those things where, once again, if you look at the history, the way our schools are funded are based on property taxes, and lines were drawn based on racial decisions that were made a long time ago. And we want to get everyone to be funded based on student need. Not a predetermined number that someone, you know, through politics was able to figure out what that number was. We want students, if there's a high concentration of poverty, you should be funded based on that. If there's language needs, if there's special ed needs, we think students should be funded based on need. We're also very interested in how are students doing? This pandemic upended all of our lives. However, a lot of adults have the words they need to use to figure out how to talk about what happened. Lots of students don't, lots of little kids don't. So we really want to make sure that we're figuring out how we can talk to students about how were you impacted. So when you go back to the classroom, it's not just, okay, what did you miss in reading, writing, and math, and let's just go. We would love students to be able to talk about how did this impact you? How are you feeling? So when we talk about assessment, we talk about assessment in the whole child, and kind of saying students, we need to know what learning loss there was. We also need to know like how are students feeling, and what does it feel like to walk back into a classroom after you've been gone for 4 or 5 months. I'm a mom of 2 little kids myself, and I joke that my son's been living his best life since we've been in the pandemic, but I don't know if he's lived his best academic life, right? But he's just been enjoying hanging out at home. But I know it's a tough question for me as a parent to decide, do I send him back? Do I check on that survey, I want distance learning, or do I check on that survey, I want him to go to the classroom? So I know these are tough decisions that parents are making, and decisions that you guys have to make, but we're happy to be here as a resource. I love data, I love numbers. We're happy to help you figure out, you know, what other places are doing, what other states are doing. I'm gonna wrap up, but one thing I wanted to highlight is the way that some states are looking at this is they essentially said social distancing was not an option. They said, like, we will not let you return to a classroom if you're not able to social distance. I think that was a good way to look at it and think about what's the best way to serve kids. So I'll wrap up there, and there's lots of, I could talk all day about data and numbers, but I'll end there, and if there's anything, if you guys have any questions, and yes, there we go. Tony keeps me on schedule and reminds me of something.
It's a group effort. It's a group effort. I just want to reiterate our efforts of connecting, and relationships are important, and it's important to us to make sure that we are hearing from those most impacted, as well as listening to understand who we're not hearing and whose voices are we missing. So we collaborate and partner with educators, community members, parents, families, and students. And the idea is, how can we work together to deepen family and student engagement. We also collaborate and coordinate with parent organizations and other advocacy efforts across the state, and look to be a conduit to bring different districts together to hear from each other, but more importantly, how do we work together to make sure that we provide high quality public education to all our kids. On a national level, I just want to also share some resources. There's some great things happening across the country and in our state. And one organization that I would just mention, that there's a national organization called the National Parents Union. They're on Twitter, but just giving an example of a national network of parents coming together to make demands and advocate for equity in their schools. A couple of podcasts, 2 podcasts worthwhile checking out, 8 Black Hands and Citizen Steward. We need to think about who our messengers are and equip and train and provide them with the tools that they need to get their voices out, but also to make sure that we're thinking about how we educate all of our kids through an equity lens.
Tony, what was the second one? Each Black Hands and
Citizen Steward.
Okay.
Chris Stewart. Citizen, CITIZEN. Did I pass that? Did I pass that?
Can you do a follow-up email?
I can definitely do a follow-up. Sure, definitely will. And we have a field guide to education and the future of Connecticut, the future of education in Connecticut, as we are collectively on the effort to reimagine how we do what we do. Any questions? We will send a follow-up email with our contact information. We also have a director of research and director of policy and research, Hamish McPhail, and we have a public relations manager, Stephen Sidoric. And we look forward to continuing the conversation and the work together.
Do you have a white paper on the approach that you recommend in terms of that funding piece, funding the need, rather than if you have a succinct way of explaining what you're looking to do?
We are in the process of putting that together. I think in 2017, there was an effort to revamp the ECS formula. And the way we describe it is the work was started, but it's not finished. There's no white paper, but we are actively working with communities around working on devising what's best, what do communities need. I think for us and from our perspective at ConCan, we don't want to come in from a top-down approach. And I think when you talk about school funding, it's very nuanced and very complicated. And we're trying to figure out what's the best way to serve the needs of students, and less kind of this solution is the right thing, more about how can we all walk away from the table and say, I feel like my needs are met, parents are getting what they need, and parents feel comfortable and understand what that funding means. Because I think where we are right now is there's all these numbers and these line items that make sense to a whole bunch of people. It's not, like, I have no idea what it means from like where does $1 go? So that's where we're looking more to be. So not specifically kind of one specific policy solution, but how can we be more clear about reforming funding that's meeting the needs of the students? And it may not be a one size fits all. It may not be the same thing that works for every city, but we want to make sure that students are getting the needs that their needs met. We did a field guide in 2018, and we're redoing a field guide for 20. It's supposed to be 2021. Everything's up in the air right now, but it's one of the things that we're looking at. And also, now that COVID happened, it also gives us an opportunity to think about what are the actual needs of some districts versus others, and how are you making those decisions around PPE, and like how does the state decide where do resources go?
Can I just do a follow-up
Yes.
question? In your conversations, so I see deficits in 2 areas, operational and capital. And operationally speaking, when you talk about PCS, one of the Achilles heel of it all is that they left the foundation cost of what it costs to educate a child at 11,000, which is not anywhere near what we're actually most of us spending. And then from the capital side, when we talk about the effects of the redlining, and so even if we got equitable funding to build schools or repair schools, we'd still be starting from a different baseline because we had so little funding to start with. So is there a conversation evolving around construction reimbursement, looking at communities that were, in that situation of having lower property values because of their money? Is that part of the conversation?
That's actually an interesting point. There is a conversation around figuring out if there's a way for there to be like a statewide, like maybe one mill rate or just there's lots of different conversations to talk about like how the state can chip in, but you know, taxing conversations are always complicated to have. But one of the things that fundamentally we believe at ConCan is it is the way that it is right now because of decisions that were made based on a history of racism. So if we as a state aren't ready to do the work to undo that history, I don't think we're ready to do anything, and we're just kind of putting band-aids and patching and not doing the right things. So the work that we're doing is embarking on, one is telling the truth about how we got to where we are. So cities are underfunded because property values in cities were depressed during a time of redlining. You cannot, right now, you can't change the property values in the cities, but as a state, you can be intentional about how you're funding education to make sure that there's equity. So I'm not a data scientist, so I don't want to be the person to make the determination of what you, like how you get to the outcome. That's for the policymakers and the people in the decision-making seats to make those decisions. What I care about is that a child sitting in a seat in Norwalk is getting the funding that they need to inherently be successful and grow up to be a positive human being. We care about.
And we also care that parents are able to advocate and speak and have research-based information to inform their decisions and how they want to hold their elected officials accountable.
I'll talk all day.
Okay, you really should.
Yeah.
But another trend that's happening in our state that's also impacting this is enrollment grows in cities while it's contracting in the rural areas. And so I think that as we look at the construction reimbursement advocacy piece, we need to incentivize investment where there is enrollment growth. Because otherwise, a city like Norwalk is growing very quickly but doesn't have resources. We're going to end up with large class sizes and adverse effects. So I think
No,
for your time,
yeah, definitely. It goes back to those lines and how they were drawn, right?
Yeah.
So the cities are, you know, there's these little teeny tiny school districts that have like very few kids sitting in them, and they are made up and have the same decision making.
I would say overly regionalized.
Oh, there's that word.
Being facetious or,
I was saying that it's an idea that is worth exploring.
yeah, definitely. And be
Shared
prepared for
resources.
those conversations.
time and government.
Any other questions? All right.
Barbara, I remember you were one of ConCan's guests for the Yale School of Management Education Leadership Conference, and Katie Roy was on the panel, and grateful to see you in your elected role and your service.
Very
Thanks for
your
those
training
questions.
that got me to dig deeper. I appreciate it.
We really appreciate the time and look forward to just listening in for a while.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Extra.
Thank you. Do you have the wireless mic? The regular one?
It's called the house.
Thank you.
Just what you want.
So good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? So we're going to start our second portion of the retreat focusing around the equity work that we want to start building capacity around, not only for board members but across the district at large. So for this piece this afternoon, we're going to have Dr. Fergus start us off by introducing some of the language that we need to kind of engage in to develop a common vocabulary around how we speak to the work. On day 2 and part of today, we will also then look at some of the data across the district and how we're faring out. Thanks to Norwalk Acts and their team of Paula De Palma, who helped us in organizing the platform to compile the data and break down the data to be able to look at our data set in a very different way than what we are accustomed to. So thank you to you and your team in supporting that work. We will able to have a closer lens in terms of where we are with the work. The data is based on last year's state accountability metrics, obviously because we didn't have new metrics this year, but it allows us, although it's old data, it still allows us to get a perspective of where we were prior to COVID and hopefully where the work needs to take place in order for us to move forward as a community. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Fergus, who's putting on his face shield.
Yeah. I'm going to walk and talk, so I think you're.
Okay.
Is Sarah good?
Yes, she's listening.
I just wanted to make sure you were able to hear us and that you were able to view the work. I uploaded the PowerPoint to the drive, so it's available there if you want to follow it as Dr. Fergus begins.
All right, folks, can you hear me? All right. So I'm gonna use the face shield. This is all new. Oh, this would be interesting. Oh, this is gonna be quite interesting. I don't know what to look at here because you all look a little frosty. So, good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Estrella, for the invitation. Thank you all as board for wanting me to join you all on your retreat. Having been a school board member myself twice, I'm no longer a school board member.
Oh, you don't know?
Yes, oh no, it's a long story.
Oh, okay. Can't wait to hear it.
Yes, so although I come from a context where my school district, it's one of the 2 school districts in New York State that you get appointed by the mayor. So, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So, my name is Eddie Fergus. I am faculty at Temple University. My life's work has really been around how do we understand educational equity as it exists within schools, but also how do we remedy it. So, I've been started 25 years ago as a high school social studies teacher. Went off to grad school and ended up sort of really getting invested in understanding beyond the question of sort of why do we have an achievement gap, but getting much more into how do we see the opportunity gap intersecting with our achievement gap, right? Because we constantly have a conversation about achievement gaps. We're constantly asking the question, why aren't kids performing? An opportunity gap conversation allows us to ask, what's the texture of what we are offering in the context of our schools, right? And we've done such a good job exploring the achievement gap dialogue, but we haven't expended enough energy around the opportunity gap. And that's really been my wheelhouse of focus for the last 20 years, and really sort of extrapolating an understanding of it. So a lot of it involves, I do a lot of research. I also get to do work where I partner with school districts on how to remedy their opportunity gaps, and also for them to study for themselves, am I getting better? So that's why I'm more often, even though I am faculty, I do all the faculty stuff, I teach classes, I publish a lot, but I really enjoy being in schools. Because it's a matter of also needing to study, well, what does it look like when we actually see change happen? Not in terms of on the back end, like, oh, we did something, and we had great outcomes, and let's promote the great outcomes that we got, which is great. But we need to understand, how did we get there, right? And I'm sure as board members, you're constantly wanting to hear about, well, what's the right funding formula, right? What are the pluses and minuses of having a need-based funding strategy versus a population-based funding strategy, right? What does it mean for, I think, your word regional, right? Like, what does it mean for having different regional sort of setups of whether it's a need or a population-based, right, approach to funding? So, all that to say, been the sort of the focus of the questions that I've been exploring for a long time, and working directly with school districts, which has been sort of not only working with school districts, I also work with state education departments. So particularly around what I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, and a lot more tomorrow, which is around my area of focus, which has been disproportionality in special education, discipline, and gifted AP and honors. What I call the trifecta of school opportunity practices that play a pivotal role in setting kids up for the types of educational experiences that are possible for them, right? And so in the work that I get to do at state education departments, I've worked with New York, California, Maryland, Texas in writing their state plans that they have to submit to the federal government around disproportionality. I've also worked with the feds. I present often, well, I haven't presented in the last 3 years, but prior to that, I would present often to the Office of Special Education Programs around disproportionality. Because they would have a group of researchers that they would have coming in and really helping them think through how do they adjust their regulatory pieces around what they're asking state education departments to do around addressing issues of disproportionality. So, and I've also worked with the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights when they sue school districts around disproportionality as well. And also with the Legal Defense Fund and NAACP on the same endeavor in terms of when they sue school districts around it. So I do a lot of things, but all still to the same goal around addressing the opportunity gaps. And so part of it has been, and what we're going to expend some energy today around getting, I'm a big fan of let's make sure that we have mapped out and built the muscle that is necessary for us in terms of what we understand equity to be, right? Because you each bring personal and professional experiences that really define the terrain of how you're going to continue to explore these issues here in Norwalk. In particular, I want us to do a little bit of work today prior to when we dig into the data tomorrow, right? I want us to have some level of calibration that we've done together first before we look at the data, right? And the data that you're going to look at is using disparity formulas that I always say, I have a lot of school districts that I work with that use these formulas that will constantly say, oh, we're using the Fergus formulas. I'm like, no, they are not my formulas. They are the federal government has been using them for decades. I just have been using them and I coupled them together and I offered it often to school districts and really supporting them particularly around building it as part of their data dashboards, right? Because it allows you to ask and answer questions around your opportunity gap, right? Much of the data dashboards that school districts take on have them asking and answering questions around the achievement gaps. But we also need to have data structures that allow us to answer questions around opportunity. So that's why we're going to expend some energy tomorrow around that. And but today we need to build our muscle. We need to have some of the common place that we're going to work from. So today we're going to establish some common language around what is equity for ourselves. What is it that we bring to the table in terms of around that concept. And I'm going to keep referring to equity as a conceptual tool, right, that allows us to explore different facets of whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, other isms, and how they manifest within the school context, right? It's a conceptual tool that we can use to help us understand why is it that we are seeing particular populations experiencing this, right? Where we can bring in sort of an understanding of what are the dynamics of race, ethnicity, or of sexism, right? So for example, you're going to see some patterns where boys are experiencing a degree of higher levels of behavioral suspensions or expulsions, right? And we're going to need to explore not just what is the nature of sort of how we do suspensions, right? But we're going to have to ask and answer the hard question, which is, but why is it happening to boys in a particular manner in comparison to girls, right? Is there something particular around how we understand and engage boys, right? Is there something about boys themselves that it's inherently they have behavioral issues? Or is there something about a combination of all that stuff, right? And that requires us to have some conceptual sort of agreement around how are we talking about and understanding gender, right? In those very explicit and very implicit ways in which we talk gender, right? The ways in which I remember with my son, who's now 20, when he was in kindergarten, you know, one of his teachers said, you know, oh, Javier writes so well for a boy. I'm like, you could have just done well by saying he writes well, right? But that boy piece almost felt as if there was a qualifier, right? It was like, oh, you know, I just don't expect it for boys, and he just did it so well, right? So there's a dynamic there that equity provides us a conceptual terrain for us to kind of practice this stuff. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. I'm a big fan of kind of pushing, if you're familiar with Vygotsky, he talks about zone of proximal development, right? So the idea of zone of proximal development is that we all have growth, and meaning that every person in this room, none of us are self-actualized. We're always seeking to develop and grow and be better, right? That's why we read self-help books. You know, that's why we watch Brene Brown or, you know, Joel Osteen or, you know, or Super Soul Sunday, whatever you watch or do, right? Because we're always seeking for that next journey. And part of what I want to make sure that we're comfortable with is we're going to push ourselves into a zone of proximal development through the course of our time. And that's what we need to do because none of us are self-actualized in understanding this dynamic around equity, right? Which is why I have this contract piece that I'm going to walk through and make sure we're all comfortable with. You know, the first one is pushing our growing edge, right? That's that zone. Reconciling that there are spaces of growth that we still need to do. You know, it's and which is not always an easy endeavor, right? Because we feel comfortable with how we understand the world, right, and how we've made sense of it, and it's also the way in which it comforts us because it's also the way in which we explain our own behaviors, right? It's kind of like, you know, one of the things that I've been conscious of is, you know, when I'm standing in line in the grocery store and I'm standing behind somebody who all of a sudden I see them pull out some type of cash assistance card or food stamps to pay for their food. I have to be mindful of orienting myself so I'm not looking down at their food to judge or determine what type of food they're buying, right? I have to pay attention to my own growth points because there's a comfort that exists within our society that has given us permission to judge and determine what kind of foods are allowable for folks who are living on limited income to buy. Instead, I've been working on the facet of recognizing, you know, folks who are living on limited income also like steak. They may also like scallops, and that is okay. It is not I'm not going to demonize them for it, right? They may also have those types of tastes. You know, some of us, I remember growing up eating Spam, right? There are moments where I still have a craving for Spam or tang, right? And because that's part of what we bring into our understanding of the world, but it also helps to rationalize how we behave. So pushing ourselves in our growing edge today, I'm going to kind of push you all, but I'm always going to ask the question, you know, is it okay if I push you, right? Is that okay? All right. Well, I want us to consider what's in it for us, where we're trying to go with this work, right? This is not I was talking to a reporter the other day who asked me the question, do you see this as is this a moment or a movement, right? And I'd like to say, I said, this is a continued movement, right? This is not all of a sudden a new movement that's arisen as a result of what we saw, sort of the domino sort of effect of events that transpired in late May to early June, but rather it's a continuation of movement dialogue that have waned in importance, but now have come back right? In a way that I think it's awakened folks, right? And I want us to be cognizant of, as we move into sort of our equity lens, that what's in it for us as we are engaging in this moment in time, right? That it's going to give us permission to push a little bit more. We're going to listen with respect, staying engaged through our time, struggle together. I always remind folks, there's going to be a level of discomfort that's going to happen. You know, we got to love discomfort, because discomfort is the spaces in which we know that we're growing, right? It's kind of like, you know, the one time that I took a cycling class, right? The cyclist person said, okay, turn the knob. And for those of you who've ever taken a cycling class, which I didn't know, I'm like, oh, sure, I'll turn the knob, right? Oh my goodness, the pain that transpired, right? And I remember the cyclist person saying, you know, well, if you're not feeling this, then you're not growing, right? You're not stretching the boundaries of what you thought were the boundaries of who you were in terms of your legs. And even though that was the only time I took the class, right? I appreciated that message, and that's probably why I went to that class. That was the meaningfulness that I was supposed to draw out of it, right? And I want us to be cognizant that there's going to be spaces of discomfort, and then that's okay, right? We're going to push along that. And then finally, speaking our truth and respecting the truths that others are bringing to the table. You know, everybody has a particularized truth that they're working from and working with in terms of how they're having these conversations, which is great. And, you know, I'm a big fan of hearing all sorts of stuff. But I also want to be cognizant that as adults, we've got to be really good about knowing what it means to respect the truths that others are bringing to the table, which means when we hear, you know, we all have our own trigger words, right? That once we hear that word, we're like, oh, I'm triggered, right? And you go into in your mind of like, I got a response ready, right? I want us to take a moment to sort of quiet that voice and just listen the completeness to the truth that's being shared, and be able to sit in the space of asking the question, you know, what I heard you describe is, can you tell me more, right? Because part of what we are also unpacking and hearing each other's truths is that with each truth, there is a layer of stories that are sitting behind it, right? And all we're getting is sort of the headline piece of that truth, and we need to practice sort of this ongoing understanding of what it necessarily means for us to kind of get to that stuff that's behind it, all right? Any questions around any of these contract pieces? Make sense? You're on board? You like it? Yeah? Okay. All right, couple assumptions. We're all well-intentioned and good people in this room, right? Right? Yes. Okay, good. I never want to take for granted. I don't want to take silence to mean agreement, right? But we're all well-intentioned and good people in this room, right? None of us have all the answers to some of this very complex stuff. That's why it's important that they're not only sort of, you all as board members are sort of really struggling through this, but you also have, you know, staff here also who are from the school district that are also here to have that exploration and be in a space of needing to and wanting to know more. There's some things that we'd rather not talk about, right? But I think we need to sit in that space of discomfort and wanting to speak to it, right? It's you know, I always remind myself of, you know, I have two kids, and they're 16 and 20 now. My 16-year-old, my youngest, is my daughter. I swear, every day since she's been born, she's been teaching me something new about what it means to exist as a girl in this society. It's a space of knowledge that I have no frame of reference. And I really learned a great deal when she was in middle school, because I just did not know how hard it was to be a middle school girl. It is tough. But there was a recognition, it's a space of humbleness that I had to be in terms of how I spoke to her about middle school was firmly framed from my truth of having been a middle school boy, right? And so for our work, you know, I always remind myself of that, because there is a place in which we have to sit in sort of a level of humbleness in recognizing you may not know everything. You may not have a frame of reference to it, and that is okay. That is completely okay for us to kind of be in that. And lastly, last assumption is that there's always inherent risk in terms of having these conversations. The inherent risk is I may say the wrong word. I may not understand it properly, right? Not everybody may understand what I'm saying, right? that's okay for us to kind of reconcile that that's going to be that level of risk. But we've got to be willing to make sure that we're okay with supporting each other through those moments of risky experiences, right? Of using the terminology that may not necessarily be correct, or what we may perceive as correct. All right? All right, the last thing I'm going to mention is one of the things that I appreciate that Glenn Singleton does around Courageous Conversations. And how many of you are familiar with Courageous Conversations? Let's see. A couple of hands. That's the text, yeah. So Glenn has been doing this Courageous Conversations work, 25 years plus, right? And the focus is really around how do you create the context to have a safe but yet but pushy conversation around race specifically. And one of the tools that he provides is what it's called the compass, and that's the compass. So the idea of the compass is reconciling that there are 4 quadrants of places to which we talk from in engaging conversations around race, right? And his idea around the compass is that it's 2 things. One is that it provides a place for us to kind of pay attention to each other. Meaning, so for example, some of us, like you see the feeling quadrant, right? Some of us may speak about issues of racial inequality from a feeling space. I am angry. This is troublesome. I am perturbed, right? And be able to kind of hear each other from that space. But yet some of us may be from a thinking space, right? Which is, well, I need to understand a little bit more. Can you tell me where it comes from? Can you show me more data, right? So it's an intellectual exercise for some of us. We may be entering, but we're all entering the same conversation, but yet we're entering it from a different quadrant, right? And what he provides is not only sort of a place in which we can kind of understand that we're all entering from a different quadrant, but what's the work going to need to be for us to all be able to respect that we're all in different quadrants, but each one of us has to get to a space where we can live across all 4 of the quadrants, right? So the believing and morals quadrant is around sort of how do we, being able to talk about sort of where we're trying to go is a matter of sense of humanity, right? That there is a moral purpose that's actually sitting in front of us, versus the social or doing quadrant is around action, right? Some of us enter these dialogues around equity where we're all about, what are we doing tomorrow? Who are we protesting? What are we changing, right? Where somebody who may be in the feeling space is I'm really distraught by this, I'm really bothered, right? How do they find sort of a common place is we've got to develop a set of protocols of how we can talk with each other so that we get to what he calls the center space of this compass, right? So as we're talking today, we're going to share our truths. I want you to be attentive to where are the moments where, as you share, which quadrant am I necessarily coming from, right? Am I coming in from the thinking quadrant, the moral quadrant, the feeling quadrant, or the doing quadrant, right? And I'm going to bring this up a couple of more times to kind of just remind us of how we kind of engage and manage each other's set of truths that we share. All right? Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, now, we are going to, there's an activity I want to do, but we're having problems with the poll everywhere. So I'm going to improvise how we're going to do this one. Of course, now it doesn't want to go back. All right. So this is how we're going to do it. We're actually going to, rather than doing it sort of from a technological space, we're going to do old style. We're going to do it from paper. All right. So if you have a sheet of paper that you could use, yes. Oh, from the website? Yeah? Okay, let me see if it, I'll try it that way.
Yes.
We're gonna try to do it, can Sarah hear me? We're gonna try and, switch to the actual online app to facilitate it. So
Okay.
we're gonna
Oh,
go
it is
back
showing
to
up.
that.
You're right.
Yeah.
Doing it that way, you're right. Okay, so this is what I'm gonna have you all do. So either on your phone or on your laptop or tablet, whatever you're using. So if you're gonna go to your laptop, you can type in the URL that's all the way up there. It says polled.com/EddieFergus512. Or on your phone, if you want to use the text message feature, you type in the phone number 22333, and then where you put a text message in that box, you type in EddieFergus512. So whichever one works just fine. Disregard the hello and hi there. That was my test run. And once you do that,
What's the beginning of the URL? G as in all, O-U-L?
POLLEV.com.
K-O-L-L-U-B?
EV as in
yeah. Then whenever you're ready, just give me a thumbs up for everyone who's logged in. Once I see enough thumbs up, I'll give the instructions.
I'm going to do it on my iPad.
Exactly. I'm all about chunking, right? I'm going to give you small chunks of the instructions first. God, these space shields are hot.
First-hand knowledge of what we're asking from our staff.
Exactly. Yeah, I was walking around a clothing store yesterday with my mask for like 30 minutes, and I was like, I had to step outside to get a break. I'm like, okay, so we should have mask breaks. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. All right. So whoever typed in test, somebody. Oh, that was you. Okay, perfect. So this is all right. So thumbs up. Everybody's. Not okay. Thumbs up. I see it.
Sarah's still there.
Sarah's still doing it. Okay, I see one shaking of the head back there. Is that Yvette?
What's a username, Eddie?
Okay, are you on your phone?
I am.
Okay, you typed in the phone number 22333, and then in the text box you typed in EddieFergus512. Okay, so once you're there, you just stay there. You should get a reply back that just says you've joined Eddie Fergus's full letter. Okay, you stay right there. You are perfect. All right, Sarah is still getting on, right? Folks over here, we're good. So oh good. I see a lot of hola tests. Good. Double standards. All right. So this is what we're going to do. Mika Pollack, who she's a former lawyer for OCR and is now a professor at UC San Diego. She studies how race shows up in school. And one of the concepts that she writes about is this idea that whenever we're engaging in conversations about equity broadly, there's always tensions that show up, right? And the tensions are personal, structural, and strategy. The personal tensions are, am I ready for this conversation, right? Or I'm nervous about, or I worry about, or I think about, right? And those are things that I want us to be cognizant of, sort of what are those set of tensions that we're all bringing into this as we endeavor into this. So that's the personal tension. The structural tensions are, is my system ready for this? Whatever your system is, your organization, is my system ready for the type of exploration that's going to be necessary to do this work? And what are those tensions that I have about them? And then lastly, the strategies tension is, do I have enough of the right strategies ready to make these changes happen, right? What am I missing? Do we need more of this? Do we need less of that, right? And that's that strategy stage. So we're going to start with a personal tension. So what I'd like for you all to do, whatever feature you're using, whether it's your phone or whether it's your tablet or your computer, I want you to type in, and you can be as long, as winded as you want, right? What's nice about this is it's anonymous, so we're not going to know who, but rather we can have a communal dialogue around what are those tensions. So I want you to start first with, what are your personal tensions? What are your set of personal tensions that you have as you all have been endeavoring around this equity work here in Norwalk, right? And that can be from a space of, how you are comfortable with or uncomfortable with X, Y, or Z, all right? So I want you to take a few moments to type that in, and then it'll start populating up here, all right? I'm gonna give folks a minute and a half to type in their initial personal tensions. And it could be one-word answers, 2 words. It does not need to be a whole thesis or dissertation. All right, we're going to do 15 more seconds. Eight, 6, 4, 2, 1. All right. You all did great. First, in terms of technology's sake, did a good job. Really easily starting to populate this. So I'm just going to read out a couple of things, right? And for us to kind of just to briefly talk out loud around some of these set of tensions. I always say one of the things that we want to be cognizant of is that everybody has personal tensions. Everybody has structural tensions. Everybody has strategies tensions around it. We're all coming, in some ways, at sort of an equal footing around sort of having points of angst in terms of how we're trying to sort of do this work. So some of, I'm just going to read them, no particular order. All POC, which people of colors, don't understand equity issues in the same way. Priorities and depth of focus and time management. Setting, unintentionally offending, insecure, double standards, not knowledgeable enough, personal hang-ups about racism and racism, capacity assumptions. I was raised to respect the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, and it hurts me that everyone is operating from that basic understanding. That hurts me that not everyone, I missed the not. Misogyny, soul work, capacity assumptions. Adults are placed before kids. What I bring when I enter the room and its impact, not leaving anyone out. People judge me by how I look and don't take the time to understand my lived experience and the cultural competencies that I bring to the table, finance, uncomfortable naming white supremacy, navigating and helping others navigate emotional boundaries and conversations that are emotionally intense. What are some of the things that you all are hearing as sort of what resonates for you as sort of some of the common places of personal tensions? And there's no right or wrong answers. This is where we can practice speaking our truth and respecting the truths that others are bringing.
A lot of it's about perception.
Yes, yeah, right. That perception you hold. I always find it's always interesting. The idea of perception is like I have a perception of how I perceive you perceiving me, right? And it becomes very circular, right? Others, what are some of the tall trees that kind of stand out for you?
There's no concern around the message.
There's no concern around the message. That's a good point.
Sarah, I think.
Sarah made a point. Oh yes, yes, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that I always find it interesting when it's illustrated how much we're all walking around in our own heads.
Ah, that's a good point. How we're all walking around in our own heads, right? And what would it mean? What would it look like? How do we practice? What's the protocol that we use to get out of our heads, right? That's a great point. And again, this is that personal tension place that we're operating from, right? That's sort of that internal angst that we have in all the roles that folks have in this room to kind of move into this. You know, I remind folks as we go through these tensions, we're going to keep unpacking them during the course of our time, right? Because I'm always pushing is that we are at a healthier and more vibrant space over our time period together, so that as we land in understanding the complexities of how the problems exist, manifest, and how we solve them, that we get better around managing through and in some ways dissolving those set of tensions, right? All right, we're going to do the next one. So the next tension is structural. So here in structural tensions is specific to what are you seeing as the tensions around your system being ready? Now the system we're going to commonly talk about here is Norwalk Public Schools, right? How is Norwalk Public Schools as a system, as an organization? What are some of the tensions that you feel about it being ready for or having contended with issues of educational equity? So, again, I'm going to give you a minute and a half to kind of just share your thoughts. What are your points of tension?
Would you mind, because I can't see just too far, just giving a little bit more of an example for me before I start?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Do you mind? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So some of the structural tensions, I hear often is the idea of, are we, is our system ready for changing the way in which we do our discipline practices? Is our system ready for how we are ensuring that all of our kids have an opportunity for enrollment in honors classes, let's say, or are we ready to to change the funding, the way in which we kind of dole out dollars for certain activities versus others? It could also be at a staffing level, the nature of diversity that we have among staff. We're not ready for diversity, what that necessarily means. Do another 10 seconds. going to share out some of what I see here. Inconsistencies in priorities and funding, not knowing I didn't know that was an option, white fragility, funding limitations, lip service only, not enough folks appreciate the diversity of NPS, unintended biases, good people think they are doing good but are causing harm. I don't know who to speak to. Adults often get in the way of what is natural for kids. Some adults need soul transplants, lack of communication, not seeing the bigger picture, diversity in senior staff, deep mistrust in some pockets of the ecosystem. Everyone is in the same boat. People in the system saying they believe in equality, yet their actions speak differently. Lack of support from other governmental bodies. Hear a lot of, and as we talk about the system tensions, system being reflective of individuals, right? The sort of, on one hand, sort of individuals that exist in there, but also the collective of individuals who exist within the system as sort of one of those points of tension, right? What do you all also hear as you think about structural tensions? Stuff that's up there, or things that now stand out for you?
These are all symptoms of a well-operated system.
Symptoms of a well-operated system.
Yes, in the sense of being mindful of what's reiterated, within structural racism. These are symptoms of the system at its best.
Right.
These feelings that are perpetual.
Right. Okay. All right. I hear that. Yes. Yes.
I think you have an inherent structural tension in that school system. You've got parents who aren't organized. You have volunteers. You have board members that are volunteers, and you maybe don't have matching needs as all these people that are being paid, and are unionized and are organized. They're basically organized to fight us.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. These are some good stuff. Yes, Sarah.
I was going to say that it did seem like there was a certain number of answers that focused on individuals within the system, but I think we spoke about this before you were here this morning a little bit, that the system itself has things baked into it that are inherently problematic, and it's not that it doesn't matter who the individuals are in the system, but the results will be the same or similar unless we can unpack the things about the system that are functioning in this way, and a lot of it has to do with how things are assessed and measured.
Great. Thank you so much for saying that, Sarah. Right, and that's why I wanted to make sure that when we talk about individuals, we also recognize that the collective of individuals are also manifesting that which the system is giving them permission to do. Right? It's the, so where we may see, whatever sort of behaviors may get demonstrated by an individual, we reconcile that it's also the individual living within an ecosystem that gives permission for that to happen, right? And I think the ecosystem here is our NPS structure, right? Whether it's the symptoms which shows up as, so it can't just be it's that person. Now, one of the, Eduardo Bonilla Silva wrote a book, I think he published it, it's like 2002, 2003. It's called Racism Without Racists, right? And the idea, he's a sociologist, and what he studies is the idea of reconciling that racism is not it's not what I call sort of a blazing fire, right? Wildfire that's just spreading all the time, right? But rather, racism, because a fire sort of requires that there be an individual who's constantly there lighting it up. Rather, racism, we need to think of it as almost like corrosion, right? That seeps in and just corrodes slowly over time. And it doesn't need sort of individual actors to be sitting there to create the corrosion, but it just sits there and it's just part of how we operate, right? Just how I think as somebody said on there, it's just the way we've always done it, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to have an individual who necessarily sits in the space that does that, but it's also the system that encourages and reminds them that that is what you're supposed to be doing, right? of how you're supposed to operate, right? Whenever I do equity audits of, like I'm finishing up one now for a school district where they're trying to understand how they ended up with, they have 7 tracks at the high school. So we're walking backwards to identify how did we not only get to the 7 tracks, because fixing the 7 tracks, naming the person who does the course enrollment for honors and AP, and they have super honors, right? That's one of the tracks they have. How did, we can't be just about those labels around those 7 tracks, but how did we get to that funnel, right? How did that get constructed? And there's a process that's been built in that in 5th grade, kids take a math assessment that quietly has been used to determine what's their 6th grade placement. And that's how the tracks slowly began. And it wasn't sort of an individual when asking them like, so why do you do it? Or, who told you to do that? But rather, we've always done it this way. But that's just been our constant practice, right? And that constant practice comes from an understanding, but that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be able to outline who lives on which terrain of math in 6th grade so that we can figure them out for 7th grade and 8th grade and so forth. So the last tension I want us to talk through is, I don't know why my mouth is frozen. Is our strategies tension. So the strategies tension is always sort of a hard one because I call it the action space, right? Where, okay, we're ready to do something. My tension is, do we have the right people? Do we have enough funding? Like, what's it going to take? What's our tension around being in a strategy space? And I would imagine that you all have been in a strategy space as NPS for a while in terms of really trying different things. What have been some of the tensions that have emerged for you all in that strategy space, right? Whether it's been sort of, you've taken on, pilots of particular projects to try to remedy a particular issue. What are the tensions that have arisen from that, right? And trying these things out to try to sort of remedy what you all have identified, I'm sure previously, the types of disparities that are existing in your system. We'll give you all again a minute and a half to kind of think through what are some of those strategies tensions. And you can use some of the ones that I just shared. I'm shooting in the dark in terms of what I think may be some of the strategies tensions, but those are some of the ones that I commonly hear from a lot of school districts. All right, 15 more seconds. Six, 4, 2, 1. So I'm going to read out some of the strategies, tensions. Adverse to changing how we measure success. Sometimes if you're lost, the fastest way to get where you're going is to turn around. But we don't have a consensus that the reason we're lost is because the system has incoherently and inherently contradictory goals. Pushing for more achievement in a flawed system isn't going to solve things. Improving communication with historically disenfranchised families, lack of authentic conversation. Effective solutions are often beyond NPS capacity. For example, housing. Funding structures that don't take into consideration the diversity of this district, status quo culture. People don't want to own this work and make it real. Putting appropriate weight on private evaluations leading to entitlement. Mindset shift versus adopting a program. Knowledge on handling issues. Putting resources towards implementing the strategies. Lack of community buy-in. Fiefdoms. Quality funding. Doing the same thing over and over again. Why fix wasn't or isn't broken? Why can't we continuously improve? Getting leaders to implement restorative practices, time and changing priorities. So I hear some of the strategies tension is we've tried stuff may not have worked. We're not exactly sure why it may not have worked, and potentially may have moved on to the next thing, right? Also, having a variety of constituents who are also asking for a change, right? You got to do something. You got to try something. What are some other things that you all hear as part of your strategy tension? Yes.
No strategy is going to solve everything, or for everyone.
Right.
You help one group, that means you might be hurting another group. So how do you get that balance? That balance, it's a balance.
Right. Yeah.
But I think structurally, it's structurally, there is going to be that tension because you implement some policy, a new strategy, someone gets hurt, or someone gets helped and maybe someone gets hurt.
Right. Yeah. And that's a tough balance in terms of addressing, because I think there is, reminds me of Clay Shirky's quote of, when you're accustomed to privilege, equity feels like oppression, right? Because when you have sort of a long-standing sort of process we've always done it this way, but we make a hard pivotal change, right? That works from the vantage point of putting in populations that have experienced a level of disenfranchisement in the center as the new design for how we're doing a particular practice. It may give the frame as if, this equity thing feels like oppression, when in fact we're taking an opportunity to bring to the center those who may have experienced marginalization or inhumanity as a result of that. Again, well-intentioned good people, right? But yet having to sort of construct it within systems that create these sort of habits and practice.
So I think it's really fascinating to study the history of Norwalk to understand how we got where we are. And the fact that our city was created by basically a
Excuse me, Barbara, can you speak to the mic? Because it's hard to hear from, I'm
Sorry.
pretty sure people back in here.
Sorry. Because our community was built on a merger in 1913 that brought together multiple communities with different situations, and the structure of the charter that has created these 5 districts that kind of are all scrapping for resources, we have these sort of, as somebody said, fiefdoms and very different demographics that we're trying, one size fits all doesn't work, and yet how do we solve for this? I mean, it's almost, whether you start at the charter, and the merger in 1913, or the desegregation effort in the 60s, and all the outflow Martin Magnet and everything that happened after that, our work is almost to untangle what the people before us did in their also well-intentioned efforts to do the right thing in the moment, and to build something that lasts way beyond us. I'm not interested in spending my time here unless it's going to last for decades and we really get it right.
And it takes effort. I think so. I appreciate your point around there has to be a level of, we've got to unpack or excavate that stuff, right? To understand how it manifested, what gave permission for it to live out, but then also find a place of what it means for us to replace it, right? And work from a different point of view. You know, this past week, you know, being at home, our family's become religious about watching Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. And so this week, Wheel of Fortune, they've been showing, it's a flashback. So they're showing Wheel of Fortune from the 80s. And so we're like, and it's easier, because it's like, oh yes, we can actually get the answers. But what's been interesting is that there's always one woman who's a contestant. And we've seen it today, today's Friday? So we've seen 3 days of it so far, where we see a woman contestant. And so the men get to tell the story of what their jobs are and who their families are. The women, they're asked questions around what's their home environment. What do they do at home? There's no question that they're being asked. And this is Alex Trebek, right? Around sort of, so tell me, you know, like there's nothing about their career or anything beyond sort of the home and context, right? And fast forward, you know, like we needed to have gone through different movements to excavate how is it that we sort of quietly sort of gave permission for that way of talking about and talking with women as a society, for us to reconcile now in 2020, you know something? Now we know better, and we're at a place where we're replacing our understanding that we operated from a point of misogyny and always putting sort of a patriarchal lens to how we talk with and about women. And so, to your point, we have to go through that level of excavating and paying attention to that. And it's been fascinating watching with my kids who catch it really quickly, right? That they caught that stuff. And that takes work, right? And that's the work that I'm gonna expend a little bit of energy right now sort of to talk about a particular sort of historical context that we all need to own, that we have to excavate as part of our understanding of what we're gonna do at the tail end of our time this afternoon by 3 o'clock is what's our initial sort of definitions or ideas of equity that we each bring into this room. But I wanna sort of start from a historical point of reference, right? I know, I feel like I'm putting on a costume, right?
You look great.
You all really are frosty right now, you know?
Change your voice too.
It does. I mean, you know, it's a little very light for me. That's what I'm hearing. So when we jump into sort of talking about educational equity, having been a former social studies teacher, everything's historical. Like how did we sort of endeavor into this dialogue around educational equity? And for me, there's 2 court cases that really started to pave the way for how we began defining it, right? I always say we began defining it, it doesn't give us a completeness, and that's why 65 years later, it's important that we arrive at a place where what do we know and do better now in terms of how we define educational equity. And so the 2 court cases are 1947 Mendes versus Westminster and Brown versus Ward. I always talk about the 2 because they're interconnected. Mendes versus Westminster really focused on language services, right? And it was a court case in California where the Mendes family sued regarding their daughter receiving language services, and they won. That case was important because the NAACP actually used that case and the framing of it as a way for them to approach the Brown versus Ward. So the only difference was race. So Brown versus Ward was the race version of Mendes versus Westminster, right? And what they really arrived at in terms of Brown versus Ward was sort of defining that educational equity means that we actually need to have kids sitting next to each other because the separation of them implies a level of inferiority. And not only implied it, but we also had, at that time, we had legal frameworks and as well as social interaction strategies that continuously manifested that inferiority, right? So it wasn't the inferiority was like hanging in the air randomly if you felt it, but you also had ways in which structures reminded you that you were inferior, right? So in doing that, we started to get our first definition of our educational equity, which is we need to have kids sitting next to each other, and we need to make sure that we are not manifesting a habit of inferiority. Now, how have we done in terms of talking through this idea that one group is more superior than others, right? We've never had a professional development strategy for how to necessarily tackle that, right? We've done it in a variety of strategies, which is, let's put more books, more diverse books. Oh, let's put more diverse staff. But it doesn't sort of really excavate at the core of what is it that promotes the idea of inferiority and superiority, right? And we see it in the way in which, in the example that I use to kind of frame that out is, part of what Brown did was that it not only legislated kids of color and white students to kind of to be in the same context with each other, and that was sort of what I call one piece of the integration project. But the other integration project that also happened was that you also had a range of students of color beginning to be taught solely by white teachers, right? Between 54 and 64, before we had the Civil Rights Act of 64, 38,000 black teachers out of 82,000 were fired. They were fired because Brown versus Board was about kids integrating. And you would think in some levels like, I'm a school district, I gotta integrate. Okay, I'm gonna take the kids, I'm not taking the staff, right? For me, I'm always thinking like, well, what about class size? Like now you're gonna have large numbers of kids, don't you need the staffing? I'm thinking a little too practical, right? Because there was something else that sat there. There was something else that was also giving permission for making that decision. So this is one of those historical documents that that a researcher who studies this stuff actually found, which is a letter from a superintendent in 1953 to a black teacher sharing out sort of their decision around their employment. So can somebody read the letter out loud? Sure.
I can actually see it.
Oh, you can see it, great.
You want me to use the mic?
Yeah, it'd probably be good to use the mic.
Dear Ms. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Dear Ms. Buchanan, due to the President's certainty about enrollment next year in schools for Negro children, it's not possible at this time to offer you employment for next year. If the Supreme Court should rule that segregation in the elementary grades is unconstitutional, our board will proceed on the assumption that the majority of people in Topeka will not want to employ Negro teachers next year for white children. It's necessary for me to notify you now that your service will not be needed for next year. This is in compliance with the continuing contract law. I believe whatever happens will ultimately turn out to be best for everybody concerned. Sincerely, Wendell Goodwin, Superintendent of Schools.
Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, there was some extra stuff, right? That, okay, fine, we're going to integrate. But we're not going to bring the teachers in because there was something else that was also priming the manner in which that decision was being made. What are some of the things that kind of stand out for you from this letter that give some indications around that stuff?
Can we speak to the, I'm sorry, can we speak to the mic just because social movement? Sorry.
This is going to be really out over my skis, but there's an assumption made that the children can be integrated and taught to be acceptable or whatever, but that the adults are somehow less than irredeemable. I mean, it's really this is shocking. And what that means for the livelihood for those families is also shocking because then that impacts generational wealth issues and it's just shocking.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, it is. I hadn't thought about that. What's the impact with Miss Buchanan's family in terms of losing
teacher salary to whatever happens. Who knows what she does?
Exactly. Great point. Other thoughts? Yes. All right, you'll go then, you'll be next.
I mean, the first thing that I also think of is the year. It was 1953.
Yes.
So it was quite a while ago when all this took place. But it is shocking. I agree with all of Barbara's points, but I also look at that time period and how far we've come, but how much
Yes.
farther we still need to go. But it was 1953.
Definitely,
Just
right?
stands out.
Because there was a manner in which sort of this, of how inferiority and superiority was outwardly professed, but also there was a level of permission around it, and in some ways, I always say, substantiated, right? That it was a known. Yes.
I'm actually, I remember that Sarah has my mic, so I'm going to try to. I'm gonna move you over to
Thank you. Actually, I'm reminded of something that was posted, I think last year, on one of those like a next door site where somebody bought a house somewhere upstate New York, and the new owners wanted new housekeeping staff because they didn't want to employ Hispanic staff, and so that was in 2019. So. But it reminds me of, I do this exercise with my students where we do, we've all seen these pictures where if you look at it one way it looks like this, or if you look at it another way it looks like that, to talk about perspective and writing. But, I read something like this and I think about how the narrative of history that we think of as so common, for example, that the Brown decision was a good thing, is being painted here as, well, if this happens, I'm going to have to fire you. That it was not at the time, and certainly perhaps not even now, seen as this thing that was a step towards equality.
Right. And this is our first inkling into doing educational equity work, right? This is where, in some ways, this is our foundational place, right? In which we explicitly started talking about what it meant to develop sort of an educational equity lens to our work. What's that terrain of work that needs to happen? And what's important for us to kind of sort of distill out is, as we move, think 65 years later, is that we've done the facilities work. We continue to do the funding conversation, right? We are, we've done the curricular stuff. Well, I shouldn't say we've done. We continue to do the curricular stuff, right? I know in Connecticut, somehow I got on a committee for the State Department for Connecticut on their curriculum, rewriting curriculum, diversifying it. I don't know how I got it. I think it was work that I did like 5 years ago with somebody who all of a sudden I got looped in. But I know that there's work that's happening around and attention to that. But all of that also has to rest from a place in which we're reconciling that it derives from a place of concern or questions that around this idea of inferiority and superiority, right? Who is it that we're talking about? What do we think their capacities are, right? And we see that sort of, it doesn't exist in the same explicit manner, right? As you see here. We see it in sort of, what I call sort of the quiet manners in which they show up in how we make decisions around who gets recommended for special education, and for what, and by whom, right? And what are the ways in which we are making sense of the assessments that we're looking at, right? One of the projects that I'm working on with the school district, I was walking through the data, the same data you all are going to go through tomorrow. I was walking through it with it was a group of psychologists. This is a large school district. So there were about 50 psychologists who were in the room, and who do, by and large, many of them do a lot of the assessments work, right? And I was sharing with them the data, and we were kind of just walking through what the patterns are, but also more importantly, what's our practice, right? Because whenever we look at data, we have to ask the question, what are the related practices? And so what emerged from that conversation with psychologists, there were a couple of things that emerged. One is the quiet conversation was around, as one psychologist said, well, we have a lot of immigrants here, and they have a lot of mental problems, right? And my other favorite one was somebody shared that as a psychologist, they had read an article that men have more genetic defects, so we should expect them to be more populated with special ed. So as a male, I took a little bit of issue, right? But what was concerning was it was a quiet sort of examples of how we sit with sort of some forms of how we sort of identify what's inferior and what's superior around sort of particular groupings, and how not only sort of how that exists, but also how it ends up manifesting in our behaviors or explaining in that particular context the outcomes that we were necessarily looking at, right? So this was not just this letter. I always say it's if I had time at some point, I'd love to do some historical deep dives around sort of this particular moment in time, because what I started doing was, this is Eisenhower time frame, so I ended up sort of excavating more letters like this, right? So letters like this, these were all, and this is all public record now, letters that were sent to the president, right, espousing sort of this inferiority and superiority around different groups, right? So like the top sentence, why are Negroes supposed to be allowed in white schools when they have their own? Why? Is it a crime now for white people to live as they wish as a separate race? Right? Letters that came from so many different constituents, right? So this is a faith-based organization in New York, right, that also put their plug in terms of why this is detrimental, right, for where we are going as part of our moral fabric as a society. And this last example, and in particular, I think it's children are becoming more conscious of the differences in races than ever before. Fathers are promising their sons protection in the form of guns. Mothers are weeping to think of the daughters who will be exposed to venereal germs, disease germs, and their immoral ways of life that destroy home life, right? Where we have this sort of form of sort of explicit sort of expressions around inferiority and superiority that, and I think as you said before, we've made great strides in terms of where we are in terms of, I don't want to say talking that way, sort of making that sort of assumptions, right? But it doesn't mean that we have necessarily, that has dissipated at a level that may not necessarily exist within the context of our practices, because we still have more work to do, right? And some of that has to do with the fact that social psychology research that pays particular attention to what they call intergroup contact highlights that if you continuously have limited contact with those that are different from you, right, you have fewer opportunities to practice excavating or really pushing back on whatever presumptions we may have about each other, right? We can't necessarily talk about getting along with others if you're not going to be around the other, right? It's hard to do that. This was a study that's published years ago, 2014, by the Public Religion Research Institute. I call it the Who Do You Hang Out With study, right? And it highlights just asking people, who are your close friendship networks, right? And the idea is, and as you see with each group, that there is a percentage that is reflective of the group that they have an affinity with, that they expend more energy in terms of hanging out with or have friendship networks around, right? And the question I always pose around this is, it's not a matter of who you hang out with, because we all have our affinity groups that we hang out with, and we should all have that flexibility, right? But it's not just who you hang out with and maintaining that affinity, but it's also the level to which we do that at the exclusion of not exploring other affinity groups as well, right? It's I like hanging out with who I like to hang out with, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that, and I'll hang out with, let's say, my wife's friends whenever they have their book club get-togethers, right? I know my place, how long I can stay, and I know when it's necessary for me to move, right? But it also means that I have enough, or I develop enough cross-cultural skills to be able to exist in her affinity group and hang with them until there's a point where I'm like, okay, this is obviously a conversation I shouldn't be involved in, and I exit, right? But being mindful of what that necessarily means, as if we're going to be talking about educational equity and needing to excavate and unlearn a particular point of reference, for us to arrive at a place of replacement, we have to be cognizant of how our own personal and professionalized experiences feed that, right? We have to be intentional around sort of defining what's going to do that cross-cultural work. This is a study done in 2017 by Ed Trust New York, and I remember Twitter went crazy around sort of the study, which was trying to substantiate what everybody had been talking about, is that not enough students of color are exposed to or being taught by teachers of color, which I think is a great conversation point. But what I found most fascinating was that in New York, in the entire state, that nearly 50% of white students had not been exposed to or seen. And so I thought about that from a cross-cultural point of view. So what happens when our white students are also not seen, right? What is the impact for them in terms of their own renderings of how they build their cross-cultural skills as they move into adulthood, right? And I think about that especially as students walk into my classes and how they manage, for some of them, and I've had students say to me, it's like, wow, you are the first Black teacher I've ever had. And I'm like, okay, well, I know it's going to be a great experience, right? And I appreciate the honesty that they kind of share, because this is, for some of them, they have to develop a whole new schema of how they think about what it means for me to sit as a learner with somebody who is my professor, who sits with a higher degree of knowledge and degrees, and for me to reconcile that, right? That's a whole new scheme of cross-cultural capacity that doesn't come naturally, right? I actually had one Black student 2 years ago, undergraduate student, say to me, which I was curious about. She said, when she came to office hours, she said, I just have to say, I'm enjoying your class, but I was so nervous when I saw that you were Black. I said, why? She said, you're the first Black professor I've ever had, and I didn't know what to expect. I'm like, wow. And I so appreciated her really sharing how she had to do some mental jumps to try to figure out how does she kind of live in this space of understanding who is the person who is tasked with my development that I hadn't necessarily experienced before. So we are going to, if we don't do that, we end up developing schemas, right? Right. So, like in this example of Snoop Dogg and Martha, right, on their cooking show. If you've never watched it, I see it as a great example of cross-cultural communication, where they both. Huh?
This is a real show.
Yeah.
No, it's a real show.
I figured she had them on.
No, they have a joint show where they both share story. They talk about stuff through cooking, and they share their cultural baggage. And it's fascinating to see how it's not about Snoop absorbing Martha or Martha's absorbing Snoop. It was just like I remember the episode where he was showing her how he said in his household how he grew up making fried chicken. He showed her the brown paper bag and the flour being put in, and she was fascinated, like, wow, like that's an expedient way of getting the flour on the chicken. Then using what she talked about was the bowls. You put the flour here, then you have your egg mixture over here, and you just dip everything, and then you put it in he was like, oh no, just put it in the bag, right? Where they can share sort of, this is some of our cultural stuff, right? But again, if we're absent enough of a cross-cultural capacity, right, we can easily sort of be misreading and understanding each other, right? In this caption, like, who's convicted felon, right? I think we have enough that's existing within our media platforms that have constructed the imagery of a Snoop Dogg as of what we see as a convicted felon. No, you got your Martha Stewarts as well, right? And all the different forms, right? And I always remind us that it's, there is, we swim in archetypes so easily that it's hard for us to pay attention to how well we've absorbed those archetypes until we take the moment to actually interrupt that habit, right? Like and it's not a one and done, right? You constantly have to be practicing that interruption strategy. Also, the idea of who we consider lives in the achievement gap, right? That we've constructed a great narrative of pockets of groups that live in the achievement gap. One of the arguments I always make is that white students also live in the achievement gap, right? So if we look at sort of when the NCES data, the National Center for Education Statistics, their data when they publish their education outlook report every year, you will see that specific Asian groups outperform white students constantly. But we haven't constructed an imagery where white students live in the achievement gap. They are very much in the achievement gap within the context of schools, right? As a school district that I'm working with now, they've done their data analysis, they've identified their practices, and one of the principals shared, because the principals started doing the same set of sessions that I do with them, they're mirroring it within their schools, and the principal shared at our last meeting, the last pre-COVID meeting, I should say, where staff were curious about sort of because they started strategizing around how do we remedy some of these issues. And one of the ideas that was brought up was, we should ask the Asian parents to do tutorials for the black parents on how to show their kids to be more educationally focused, right? It was a boatload of assumptions swimming in that. We can spend an hour just kind of unpacking that stuff. But what was interesting is that the principal was sharing this, that the staff shared this out, like as an idea. And the principal was like just astounded. I didn't know what to say. What is the response? And I asked, I said, well, why weren't the white parents also considered as part of the conversation? Why couldn't the Asian parents also talk to the white parents? Right? And it's because there's something that we have given permission to that our white students don't get to live in this dialogue around the achievement gap, right? So that's why I'm always very mindful around of talking about sort of this frame of achievement gap, because it constructs this imagery of who we keep as defining having an absence of something, right? And it doesn't get applied to other groups because there's a presumption, a quiet presumption of inferiority, right? And that's work that we have to be intentional about doing. So, all that to say, so we know that that's part of our historical context of what's transpired around how we define educational equity. So how do we tackle it? How do we tackle the work that is around our disparity issues? What's going to be our structural work? What's going to be our strategies work? But I also articulate, as you all are seeing as sort of a part of our historical piece, is we have to be clear around what is our personal beliefs that we also have to tackle, right? And that's why part of what we're going to do as sort of our last activity together is we're going to sort of practice sharing out sort of what lives currently on our plate of what we define educational equity for ourselves. And some of that has to do with, I want us to be clear around sort of where does our own personal beliefs also live within there. And for me, having done this work for so long with so many different districts, back in, I think it was like 2009, I started collaborating with a colleague, Russell Skiba out of Indiana University. And Russ and his team and my team, we had started working on developing a way in which we start measuring the types of beliefs that exist within our school staff, right? Because whatever we remedy, whatever strategy we put in place, restorative practices, PBIS, MTS, whatever it is, whatever acronym stuff that is the new sort of exciting acronym that we are just jazz to do, right? I think as Mike highlighted, the cure-all strategy, right? That always shows up, right? That we can't put that stuff in place if we haven't excavated and replaced the set of beliefs that gave permission for the other strategies to elicit the disparities that we have. So we started measuring beliefs. What are those types of beliefs? And what's going to mean for us to excavate and replace those, right? So, long story short, we created these scales. We did tons of factor analysis to do the validation of these scales, right? And so I've been publishing around sort of 3 particular scales that have emerged as having a strong correlation with teacher self-efficacy, right? And so the first one is colorblindness, right? So that's the first belief, right? And we're all familiar with colorblindness, right? Right? Colorblindness is, it's I think the short version is, I don't see color or I don't see race, right? But it's also not just like, I don't see it, but I also use my own frame, right? To how I am going to see things, right? I always give this story of a superintendent, white female superintendent I worked with like 10 years ago. She'd asked me to do an opening school year keynote for all the staff. I always say, I am not the rah-rah exciting keynoter, right? Like I swim in disparity stuff, right? Not the most exciting stuff to get people jazzed up. So what I ended up doing was actually doing a talk around colorblindness and different examples and having people kind of laugh through sort of what it would mean for us to kind of excavate that stuff and replace. So once I got off the stage, the superintendent came up to me and asked, it's like, Eddie, I am confused because I don't see your color, right? And I know where she was coming from. Well-intentioned, good person. It's somebody who, it's like, I went to her house for dinner whenever I was there for meetings. It's like, I got to know this person, and I know where she was coming from, right? But what I had to frame out for her was this idea of, I told her, I said, I appreciate that, but that also means that you're treating me like you treat yourself, like how you see yourself. And I had to remind her, I said, I'm not a white woman. So I'm going to do some things that are not going to be like white women, right? That there's a cultural frame of reference that you're working from as a white woman that is not what necessarily I'm going to be representing, right? And even though she says, like, well, I see everyone's humanity like I see my own. I said, yes, but your humanity is also colored by the manner of how you experience the world as a white woman, right? And and it was that moment of reconciling that that what it means to kind of work on that colorblindness is realizing that it means then I am not seeing the social experiences that are necessarily connected to your identity, right? It's like me telling my wife, I don't see your gender, right? Then I am missing a lot of stuff. A lot, right? I'm missing when she's telling me about how her male colleagues will try to explain things that she already explained, and they get all the kudos for it. Or when they make decisions, or when they, there was one instance where she mentioned how a male colleague sort of was trying to explain something and stood next to her and put his hand on her shoulder, right? And it was like, she was like, wait a second, you're trying to quiet, what is going on here, right? If I am not listening with my cross-cultural ear of how she experiences the world as a woman, and I only see that as a male, then I'm not going to be able to read what she's reading, right? Or whenever we stay at a hotel, my wife is always like, we've got to stay away from the exits, away from the first floor, away from the elevators, right? Because as a woman, she has to experience, and she thinks about safety in a very different way than I think about safety, right? So this idea of colorblindness is we don't see something, but yet we're also using our own frame of reference to kind of see things.
And can I just add something?
Yes,
You
please.
go by Ed or Eddie?
Eddie.
Eddie.
I'll tell you a story later about my name.
We'll hear it. But I like the way you bring real life examples, like that first letter.
Yes.
I think that were very disturbing, but And you look at that and you see where we are now, but we have so much farther to go. And reading, I'm also thinking about that last sentence that mentioned, it's for the best of everyone. This is the best decision that we can make for everyone.
Right.
For you, for the school district, is it for Ms. Buchanan? So I was rereading that in my mind and thought that last sentence was very telling. Snoop Dogg, Martha Stewart, I've seen the show. The Shake, I remember years ago, Mike, you probably remember, Shake and Bake? Is that Shake and Bake? So it's kind of like different styles. My mom used to make chicken like that long time ago. So you look at that and it's interesting. And it takes you back to 1982 or whatever it was.
75.
75 for you, and no, I'm joking.
Hi, the United States.
And just, President Obama, President Bush, who has a 2.35 GPA.
Right.
I mean, I think just looking at all those examples, then you, Ed, Eddie, I mean, going through all that, I think kind of brings it, we're all aware of everything that's going on, but I think you have to look at these different examples, especially starting from 1954, 1947, and well before that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's sort of unpacking all of this stuff, right? And you can just imagine, this is just me trying to express sort of what's sort of part of our national fabric. But you each have your own private sort of personal fabric of historical experience that's brought you to how you kind of think about this stuff, right? Somebody else had that.
I was going to ask you a question, but I realized I didn't really feel like it.
Okay. Real quick in terms of my name. So I go by Eddie for very specific reasons, right? So I was born and raised in Panama. So I came to the U.S. when I was about 10 years old, right? I guess you could call now the language of why, and I have citizenship. When I go to different parts of the country, I have to be, for some reason now, I have to be clear about this, right? I guess I'm considered part of the chain migration, right? So my father joined the U.S. military, and that's how we all got citizenship. So my name is Eduardo. My family calls me Eduardo, right? And my first day of school, when I came to the U.S., right in the school district right outside Chicago, my teacher asked me what's my name, and I said Eduardo. And I remember clearly, the teacher said, well, I'm not going to say that. I said, so you can be Eddie or Ed. So up to that point, Ed was a horse, because I had watched a lot of American TV, right? And there was no way I was going to be Ed. So I picked Eddie. So I've been Eddie ever since. At home, I am Eduardo, or Eduard, right? So, and I've never really talked about it. I actually wrote about it in the book, and there was an article years ago that I wrote, and it was one of those moments of like, and sometimes I get flack from others from the Latinx community, like, I'm going to call you Eduardo from now on. And I said, okay, I get it, but you also got to reconcile like how I've had to figure out when I get to be Eddie and when I get to be Eduardo, right? So that's in terms of why I go by Eddie, and I don't respond to Ed. Yeah. Deficit thinking. So the idea of deficit thinking is premised on the presumption of how we understand, particularly in educational spaces, performance is presumed that there is a cultural or a genetic flaw that exists within the group, right? That if the parents would just read to their kids at home, I would be a better reading teacher, right? If the kids would just pull up their pants, they would be much more focused on schools. If the blah, 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 and there's a long history within the context of the U.S. where we give permission for that argument, right? And then lastly, the last belief that showed up is what we call poverty discipline. Right, so the poverty discipline belief is the idea of, as a society, we quietly and not so quietly, we've made agreements that part of why groups exist within spaces of poverty is because there are psychological or behavioral dispositions that keeps them in a state of poverty, right? And the manner in which we respond is disciplining the poverty out of our kids and families, right? My quick example is a school district I worked with years ago. Oh gosh, probably like 11, this is 2008, 2009, they recently decided they're not doing this practice anymore. Because a colleague of mine, who's also part of the research team, also sort of tweeted out that the kids would start off the school year sitting on the floor. And so I was there, myself and my team, we were in different classrooms, and I see the kids sitting on the floor. I was like, oh, this is a 5th grade class, and I was observing. I was like, oh, this is interesting. Kids are on the floor. I'm just there to observe. And the teacher then starts sharing, okay, so let me talk to you about how you're going to earn your chair, how you're going to earn your desk, and how you're going to earn your teacher. And I was like, what? What is this? And I had to sit there the whole class because I was there to observe. And so afterwards I went back to meet with the principal. And I didn't ask the principal about that practice. What I asked the principal is, tell me how you got to that practice. Because that's what we have to excavate, right? And so what the principal ended up talking about is, he said, well, do you know where they come from? I mean, these are all poor kids, right? They need this type of discipline. And I was like, okay, tell me more. Tell me more, what is it that you understand is the context in which they're existing, and that is the way in which you are translating it into, right? And there's some range of examples that I've sort of, over the years, sort of seen in school systems, right? As a habit of poverty discipline, as a belief strategy that we have existed within our context, right? I'm going to pause there. Thoughts, reactions around these 3 particular beliefs, right? These are the ones that I'm very mindful of. This is where we have to make sure that we're doing some deliberate excavation, unpacking, and replacement alongside whatever structural work we want to do, right? Because it's not just a matter of like, let's just buy the new package or the new curriculum, whatever. It also we have to contend with this other stuff as well. Oh, yes. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me okay still?
Yep.
Okay, good. What I was thinking of when you were describing those 3 buckets of things is a bigger overarching societal idea that meritocracy can exist, and also that school is one. And I think zooming out to that, I think is something that really needs to get excavated. That not only, and also that the values of that meritocracy are correct.
Right.
So I want to say that thought. Also, I have another thought that I've lost.
No, that's okay. Your meritocracy one was a great one, right? And I appreciate you bringing that up. The idea that, if you work really hard, right, you're going to achieve a level of success that's comparable to the level of effort that you put in, right? Wholeheartedly agree, and I think as a society, we kind of thrive on that sort of, that social fabric of idea that if you do that, and that it's possible, right? I always say it's like, yes, but, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I always say trips up the degree to which that effort is going to actually translate into that level of accomplishment of whatever that may look like, right? And in a way that is going to require, for some of our kiddos to operate in ways that may be ways that sort of they have to be resilient towards, right? One of my doctoral students is studying Black students who are in predominantly white schools that are in AP and honors classes, and talking with them around what are the dispositions that they take on to be in cultural environments that historically have not had them in, right? To dig at sort of this idea of, so where they may have demonstrated a level of meritocracy of earning to be in those classroom spaces, but then what is the other stuff that they're going to need to do so that they can survive in there? Meaning survive in terms of, when they're experiencing moments of microaggressions, right? I have a school district that they're moving into their second year of doing this practice where last summer they decided to, what they call, they want to de-level their high school honors and AP classes. I mean, I forget how many levels they have. But they decided to go from the vantage point of, let's identify all the students in 8th grade that meet the criteria, but never had an opportunity to be recommended for. So they started with that. And what they actually identified a little over 130 students of color who met the criteria similarly as their white students and programmed them automatically into honors classes. So last year was their first year of implementing this, right? So that's the structural change work. We're just going to put them in there, right? Oh, let me finish this and I'll come back to you.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was in charge.
No, it's okay. So they put that in. So then what transpired over the course of this year were the teachers started sharing emails with the coordinator. And then the coordinator started bringing it to the team meetings, right? Because as we develop our equity lens, we need to see what are the facets of this sort of personal belief stuff that we've got to excavate. So one of the emails that stood out the most was the teacher shared out, we're concerned that our veteran AP and honors kids aren't getting as much of an opportunity anymore, right? And what was interesting is the idea of veteran, right? Because these are only 9th graders, like, come on. So, but there's this notion of, but they've always been gifted. And now they're in a context where we've diversified with kids who have the exact same criteria, right? Met the criteria, have the competencies, and are existing in these classroom contexts, right? And so that idea of meritocracy, where you work really hard, but once you're in these spaces that are sort of espousing this idea of meritocracy, not everybody gets to exist in a similar vein of being perceived as having earned that place. Sarah.
Yes. And I'm glad that you just said what you said at the end too, because I think the idea of that AP class speaks to the point that I hadn't remembered, which is that I think the idea of an achievement gap itself doesn't examine that the idea of education as an achievement rather than a process is unsuitable. Like, I think that we think of education as a place for children to achieve rather than a process for them to go through creates a structure that is harmful.
Right. Now you're specifically, and that's so. And I'm going to use that as we segment into this last thing that I want us to do, because it's as far as us arriving at a place of what are going to be some of the structural areas of work. I want us to, at least for today, to take a first stab at us sharing out loud what are some of the things that live within our own definition of educational equity, right? I've given a little bit of a historical context of how we've kind of manifested some of that ideas of it, but you all have your own private and professional set of ideas that you're also bringing into it. And I want us to, we're going to use the poll everywhere again as our launch pad to do this. And what we're going to do is, I'm going to have you all kind of share out what sits in front of you right now as your top 5 non-negotiable ideas around educational equity. I want you to think about it while I set it up. Okay?
And while he sets up, let's take a 5-minute break.
Yes.
Just to allow people some time to.
Yes, I can take off my mask. The shield, I mean. Oh.
Would you mind just repeating the last word that you said, your top 5 ideas around?
Educational equity, your top 5 non-negotiable ideas around educational equity.
Around educational equity, meaning what we think it should be or what we think is an obstacle?
What do you think it should be? Like for you as, yeah.
We had an east sign, and I don't know where it is. What one was it? East?
I'm like, I was thinking the whole time, I left my water in the back.
Oh, your mic is on.
I mean, we all do it.
Yeah, yes.
And I'm the worst, but.
Well, thank you for letting me know. I did notice it. No, but it's exactly right. So when it's let's use, when we're not, you know.
So we're so grateful that you're here and so enjoying the show.
Oh, great, because that's going to be part of the. So we lived in Lake Forest. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to share, you know, my mom was first garden, was one of the first women to us, so the side change.
I can imagine.
It was horrible. She was so literally crazy. But and then she goes to the forest, and in the forest, she and my Andrew and sooner or later I'm gonna say this. That is those are the conversations that I don't let heavy air see that. Don't worry about workers' comp. And at Northwestern, when I was designing that, I had a table. It was like really different. And still finding that way. And almost like, so and I was, I've ever had. It's like, yeah, and it's like very difficult to invite people to come in. Structure. You need something and it's
Right, exactly. That's why when we get to the numbers tomorrow, we're
really
going to start with the numbers tomorrow morning. So like, okay, so now we're going to use the numbers for the what you're doing today. In terms of this right now, I'm going to this. You all have your top 5 to see what else you can have now. Yeah. No, yeah, that's going to happen.
I like that too with water. I can't do it. But I only drink seltzer. I'm like, I only drink water. Water. And I put water and I just stir it and then it's so good. Yeah, I love water with lime. So good. It's so good. I mean, what's that? Yeah, it's so good. I always have to have like lemon and lime in the water. I can't just have it straight. I mean, are you? Yeah, but it's not. I found it kind of, you know. I need lemon in my water. Great. Okay, hold on. That's crazy, but I can't. Exactly.
Thank you for your comments or time. And this is my first time doing, like I do this before COVID. Like I'm in my, you know, I would take on about 10 disciplines a year. So I'm constantly 3 days out of the week. This is usually not. So like he made this, you know, like, yeah, this is first, I'm like,
I think it's pretty elegant. Right, it'll be worse than it.
oh yeah, well, yeah. I'm always like, okay. I'm gonna see what goes on. You know, and I always say I'm gonna give people a level of grace because we're going to evolve. We're going to keep on. Yeah.
Oh, really?
It's, you know, I love my team at times, they're like, why are you?
I thought it said sugar in the rocks.
It's like, I gotta eat it.
I was trying to have a little fun.
Yeah,
They do, but it's cold.
and I'm always, you know, when I was,
Yeah. Oh, really?
it's like, hey,
It's a little cold, but I think so. You know,
I know, it's like, we're making it, you know, we'll make do.
I shouldn't have caffeine anyway. I just kind of like going for a little extra charge.
My wife and I started.
I couldn't sleep until like 2 last night.
I cannot be at home.
I'm just kind of laughing at myself.
I appreciate it. She's like, look.
Let me start getting people. Yeah, but let me get.
Yeah, we got a team.
What was that?
All right.
Yeah. I just like when I take my hair.
I went ahead and made it because I taught a set of classes. And I taught it all online. For the students that appreciated that I didn't, I never did that. They said, one student mentioned that they were
Yeah, that's what I can't get.
I don't study, I don't know. I actually, so I was like, okay.
I think that's also
Okay. So Godfrey is coming right in a second.
All right,
We can get started.
people have been populating their top 5.
She also about the same one.
So we're gonna unpack a little bit in terms of our top 5, and you know, so that we arrive at a place where we are hearing the truths that we all are sharing and respecting what the truths are in terms of what sits in front of us as our top 5 non-negotiable ideas of educational equity. Because I'm going to use them tomorrow. After we go through the data, we're going to come back to these top 5. And I anticipate we're going to grow even more in terms of what we're going to be adding to what we consider our top 5 ideas of non-negotiable, what's non-negotiable around educational equity. Oh, my laptop went to sleep. So, I'm trying different things because I want to figure out what it's like to teach with this mask on, because I start teaching in about 3 weeks. So, I'm teaching a policy analysis classes.
And I'm like, this is gonna be interesting.
You might as well practice now.
I know, that's what I'm doing. I'm like, okay, can I talk through this thing? How's the face shield?
Maybe you'll find a face shield that's more transparent.
I know, right?
I saw that people were just putting,
A shield around.
yeah, a little.
I even thought about putting a shield around you, but knowing how you like to move,
know,
I was
walk.
like,
And I
that's
use
not
my
gonna work
hands.
for, and you know.
Exactly. It's going to be, and of course, Temple hasn't given us any guidance. And we're 3 weeks out, right, from school starting. But so let's kind of walk through some of these in terms of what are sort of sitting in front of us right now as some of our top 5. And again, as I mentioned, I'm going to bring these back tomorrow. And showcase sort of where we landed today in terms of what's sitting in front of us. And then tomorrow when we start off our day in grounding ourselves around, okay, so what does the disparity data showcase for us that also needs to help us think in a robust way of how we're going to necessarily, what else needs to be added to our definition of educational equity. Because I want to be mindful of reconciling that where we start from now in how we define and think about equity is based on sort of what we've been consuming already. And I want to be deliberate about the fact that you're going to consume something very different tomorrow in terms of your data. And there's going to be a level of shock and awe and push, right? You're definitely going to be pushed in a zone of proximal development that I think is a good thing for us to be in. And I want to revisit these set of definitions that you all have because it will expand. So I'm going to read out some of the stuff that's on here. Inclusion is more than real estate. Ooh, that's an interesting one. Basic needs met, respect, systems that observe each child individually, robust curriculum based on fairness and inclusion, progress monitoring in practice, not theory only, take down the fence. I take it that's a reference to the imagery of the fence, right? Around sort of what defines educational equity versus equality. Systems that have tiered interventions and effectively implement them. Systems that don't judge children by zip code and assign high or low expectations due to them. Every child achieves their potential. An environment that promotes and fosters differences of people, thoughts, and perspectives. Free from biases and prejudices. All family cultures are seen as valuable to a child. That is, not making assumptions about children of color being better off at school. Getting rid of systemic practices designed to hold some children back. All children are seen and treated as equally capable of self-directed inquiry. Rigor, accountability, equal opportunity access to specialized programs. Open door policy for everyone. Children see themselves and their culture represented in their curriculum in a positive way and not in a token way, right? What are some of what keywords kind of stand out for you all in sort of in terms of what I read or what you can see as things that are kind of common for you all right now?
Can you repeat your question again?
What are some of the key words that stand out for you all that you see sort of continuously sort of showcased here or that I read out loud to you that you have in common right now as a group? Yes?
A lot of the actions seem to focus on structural or systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Right? So so that's what's sitting for folks as part of what's defining your educational equity definition.
It seems like a lot of people are talking about really focusing on the child and the individuality of the child. So child focus.
Right, so the child focus.
Responsibility, that stands out.
Responsibility.
And respect.
And respect, right?
There's something in there about access.
Yes, I did see access several times in different formats, but you're right, this idea of access. There's also this element around that educational equity also includes sort of free of bias, right? Which makes sense, right? We want to include as part of the idea of educational equity that
we're free from sort of these set of presumptions and stereotypes and biases that we carry about each other.
See that sort of attaching to the real estate zip code,
Yes.
there's conversation that there's a place for you and a place for you, and
Right.
you know, so removing that.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. That's another representation of that set of ideas. So the last question I'm going to ask is, and this is just going to be in some ways a primer as we start thinking about for tomorrow, is so what do you think is missing?
Who we're talking about?
Huh?
Who we're talking about?
Who we're talking about, right? There's no specific mention of population, right? Other than saying children, right? Because when we're talking about educational equity, we got to be.
Teachers?
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just saying, I don't think I heard anything about teachers.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I see staff at one place, but yeah.
Oh, I missed it.
But no, but you're right. I think overall, there's an absence when, I can remember who we're talking about, there isn't a great deal of specificity, right? And that's something that I want us to hold on to for tomorrow is, so what does it mean for us to sort of define educational equity with a particular attention to specific populations, right? They're not a sort of, this was a time struggle in terms of as they are defining and applying their concepts of educational equity, that you can have a definition and idea of educational equity and including a particular attention to blah, 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 right? So it doesn't feel as if there is, and I've seen school districts do where they'll say, okay, we'll have a population, but then they feel as if like they got to link every population, right? But there's giving ourselves enough grace to know that at particular moments in time where we're going to have a laser focus on specific populations, given what we are seeing in the symptoms that are arising from our data, right? And I want us to hold on to that for tomorrow, because tomorrow we are going to talk specifically around sort of what may be those very particularized populations that we may want to keep in mind as we think back to what we define as educational equity. What else are we not seeing? Right, the sort of,
structures,
yeah.
the schools don't live in a vacuum, they're critical workers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's and I do not know Norwalk, so you all are going to teach me by what you all share, how you share it, right? But you're giving me an inclination by this statement, inclusion is more than real estate, right? So my guesstimation is that there's something going on in terms of zip codes, real estate patterns, that also rubs up against this idea of equity, right? Which means like, so how does this idea of, so however you all are engaging this notion of educational equity as a school board, there's a recognition that is also having to be in conversation with a broader community that is also wrestling with their own sort of set of tensions, right? That I'm guesstimating has something to do with zip codes.
And I also would suggest that the immigration conversation in our country is also exacerbating it, because we had a focus on one kind of equity, and we had to expand that to accommodate the growth in other areas. And there's so much tension nationally that's like trickling down into the local conversation and making things so much more contentious than we need to be when we're really just talking about children.
Right.
We have to stop politicizing children.
Yeah. That's going to be some of the work we're going to have to make sure that we're clear about, right? So this is a good start. And we're going to bring this back up tomorrow. I'm going to bring this up. So I think I may do is, there's a PDF version of this that I'm going to print out. So I'm going to have you all sort of add more stuff to it tomorrow. So 2 things before I finish. One is, I see you all have my book. And Alex asked me earlier in the week, okay, what chapters do you want them to read? And one of the things, I've switched my orientation now, and what I do is have folks read after the first presentation, right? Because I know everybody's got stuff going on, but and maybe this is just, I know I've had this experience, that there's something about when you hear an author talk, you're like, oh, I kind of want to read that now, right? Because it gives you sort of a little bit of a frame around this. And this is not for between tonight and tomorrow that you have to read. But I want you to kind of prepare yourself to read chapters 1 and 2, right? I know Barbara already shared, she read the first 4 chapters, right? Which is great. I love it. Right? Bless you.
Thank you.
So I want to encourage you all to start getting ready to start reading the first 2 chapters, right? And the first 2 chapters really dig into the 3 beliefs: colorblindness, deficit thinking, and positive disciplining, to really sort of to talk more specifically of how that textured beliefs show up in schools, right? And the second thing, this will be the last thing that I'll bring up, and I always like to do this as a closure. Of course, my laptop wants to freeze. We are always recognizing that each day is that there's learnings that we arrive at, in our conversations, and I want to sort of hold up sort of what are some of what I call the wows and wonders for each day for us, right? Because I want to bring them up, especially since we're going to see each other tomorrow morning, right? I want you all to take a few moments to kind of think about what are some wows that kind of sit with you. What are some of the wonders that you're still sitting with, or are now sort of arising for you, that we want to be attentive to, not only in terms of what we do tomorrow, but also as we move forward, right? So some wows and wonders. I want to give you all about 22 seconds to think about it.
Did you say laws is the first one?
Wows. See, this is what happened. Wows and wonders.
Wows.
Wows, yes. Right, and as a English language learner, I'm very cognizant of how well people hear me. And
We can hear it through your mask.
yeah?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Loud and clear.
All right. I'm trying to manage it not fogging up my glasses. Wows and wonders. Barbara?
I don't have anything.
You don't have anything?
It's a first
Yes.
I was wowed by the truths that were shared out from everyone. Just taking a moment to acknowledge and be surprised still the truth. And I wonder if I can call you Eduardo.
Yeah. Yes, you may. And I appreciate you asking. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
thinking, we talked about this and Godfrey just mentioned also looking at all the examples when we talked about it, like really resonated with me as we went through 1947, 1954, present day, presidents, Snoop Dogg, Martha Stewart, all that. And also the sharing that everybody has been very involved in, which is helpful. And I think the wonder is where this work will lead us to. So I think tomorrow, by the end of the day, it's a half day tomorrow,
Right.
8 to 12, right?
8 to 12.
At 12 o'clock, like where all this work will lead us to.
Yeah.
That's what I wonder about.
That's good.
Without reading the chapters that Barbara read, which I have not, I'm being honest, I have not read. But it does help when, and this also resonates with me as well. When you ever meet an author or you go to a book club or you meet someone, I'm always at the end thinking, oh, I'm going to get that book. Now I really am engaged and I really want to know more about it. So you made a good point. When you meet somebody, talk to them if they've written a book.
it makes you more apt to want to learn more about that person and their work and what they've done. So I've already put a note to share this with somebody else, just so you know, so.
Well, thank you. Yes. I figure I could tell them, I was like, I'm a little more exciting than any of my 4 books, right?
But also you're engaged, like, you could be behind the podium and talking and we're listening and watching, but I think we've all discussed this before in board meetings. It just makes a difference when you're here in person.
Yeah.
Because I think everybody's more actively participating when you're here, if you're seeing somebody. And moving around was fine.
Yeah.
I think it's a great thing.
Right.
I share your curiosity to see where we're going to go. I understand that this is a multi-layered, not just us, but the
Yeah.
staff and systems and all that. But I wonder how we get, like, there is no ideal in real life.
Mm-hmm.
So and there's never going to, enough is never going to be
Right.
enough.
Yeah.
We're just going to be continually improving, but I guess I wonder what our appetite is to dig in and really change the narrative here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great, these are great wonderings for tomorrow. I love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it.
So my wows is, I have a not as good, but a similar story to how I got my name, which was completely accidental. And I was never called this by my family, but I went to a prep school and everyone had nicknames. And the form said, "What's your nickname?" I don't know, my dad's French, I was Michel, but you have to call yourself that there.
Right.
And so I was like, well, my grandfather was Mike, I guess maybe I'm Mike. But I'd never been called Mike my whole life. I'm 14. I put that on the form when I got there. My parents weren't there, and I've been Mike ever since. So you never know.
Right.
I guess on the wonders, I have a couple. Is what happened to you? Would that happen in 2020 in the classroom? Would a teacher deign to say that or operate that way? And 2, these conversations and these questions. We all have children of different ages. Probably, I don't know your son's, how old's Jordan now?
It's 23.
Okay, so she's got the oldest, but, if our older kids were asked these same questions, what would their responses be?
Yeah. That's a great wondering, I think about it all the time with my own kids and how how they develop, how my wife and I have been very intentional about their building up their cross-cultural skills, Like we were very intentional about placing them in schools in our school district that was under desegregation order to put them in schools that were 2020, right? In terms of representations, right? And it was hard to find in our school district. But we knew that we needed to make sure that they were in spaces where their presence wasn't questioned and that they learned what it meant to engage and develop sort of those cross-cultural skills with kids and families that are different than our own, right? But it becomes, so I'm always fascinated when I talk about my work, or as my kids say, there's Dad talking about this equity stuff, or they stumble on a YouTube video of my talks, or something's on Twitter and they see my name, and also when I've been on school board, they're like, there goes Dad talking about that stuff. It's like, for them, but then seeing them and hearing them talk to their friends, right, tells me like, we're doing good work, right? That even though they protest in our faith, they're quietly absorbing. And I think that's, as you all as board members, I would imagine that's part of what we and as staff is how do we make sure that our kids are being properly sort of developed in terms of as having a healthy disposition for them to represent and do the movement work that we're tasked with doing right now. So I'm super excited about that. Yes?
I was going to say, one of the things that I think is, I would call it wonderful today.
I've never heard anybody do that, but I love it.
Big wonder. Is how so many of the examples you shared, including the ones that kind of related to the idea of meritocracy that people get that they earn or deserve, are examples of low intention good people. And and I think that offers some level of hope, a pathway that, we may not always think about it the same way or have the same way of getting there. But if we have the same good intentions,
Right.
then it's a yes and, not a yes
Yeah.
but.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So,
No, that's great. I appreciate you reminding us of, of that well-intentioned element, especially when we hear stuff that may trigger us, whatever those triggers may be, right? That we are mindful of, like, okay, the well-intentioned, they're coming from a place of curiosity, but there is a zone of proximal development that's there, right? There's more growth to be had. So we're going to carry this stuff forward tomorrow, and I want to be mindful of time because I also have to get on a conference call at 3:30, so I got to get on the road. But I really thank you all for allowing me to kind of do a little bit of introductory this afternoon in preparation for what we're going to do tomorrow. I'm so excited to kind of walk through the data that I know Paula and Yvette and there's somebody else who was on the call. I can't remember who did such great work in pulling that stuff together. I can't wait for us to kind of, I'm a big data person, so for me, I crunch data all the time. So, Diana, yes, there we go. So those are the folks who I really appreciate all that hard work, and I cannot wait to share and walk through it and for us to kind of wrestle together. All right? So, thank you, thank you, thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Fergus, Eduardo, for coming and joining us today and for being part of the journey ahead for Norwalk in this conversation that in many times is going to be difficult because it's going to put us in a place of discomfort, but necessary discomfort to really move the work forward in doing some of the things that a lot of the board members articulated today as essential to doing good work for children. In terms of some of the wonderings, this is basically the launch to the work that we will be embracing alongside Norwalk Acts, the collective and other community support organizations and partners and philanthropists that have been very interested in working with us in ensuring that we take a deep dive as we start thinking about the new strategic operating plan and looking at the needs of the district with the equity lens in mind. So the goal is that tomorrow's data dive will start the thinking behind some of the priorities as we continue in the listening and learning tour that we're going to start in August, so that we can start collecting not only qualitative data but also quantitative data of how our community is doing and meeting the needs of all students, and then utilizing that information to inform a strategic operating plan that we're hoping to start developing in January after we've completed the study and the listening and learning tour. So I just wanted to provide that context so that as we continue to embrace in the dialogue tomorrow, we have an understanding of where this journey is going to lead us, because like it was articulated yesterday, and I think in part of today's conversation, there is a need for us to start thinking about our next 3 to 5 years and what that's going to look like. And I know COVID has created some challenges around us being able to do this, but it doesn't mean that we stop. It just means that we have to collect, think, and re-strategize in how we do this given this new reality, right? Because this is not going to end anytime soon. And as a result of that, we have to just remold and rethink how we do things so that we stay the course and continuing to excel and prosper as a district. So just in that, I just want to provide that context because it's really going to inform our work tomorrow and in days to come. Also, I just want to remind the board that in connection to the work we're doing here today, Dr. Fergus and I mapped out a plan of action in terms of professional learning and listening of principals, teachers, students. I know that's something that is very dear to Godfrey's heart, in terms of the voice of our young adults as well as our younger babies in this work, because I think they bring a lot of context into the conversation, as well as our parents and community members and leaders. All of these different constituents will be part of the conversation that will provide us with the qualitative information that we're going to hopefully utilize to develop a strategic operating plan. So again, thank you for a really enriching day, a day full of enriching experiences and conversations. I think yesterday was also a great day where we immersed in great dialogue in terms of how we engage as a collective governance team to really move the work forward. So I really appreciate everyone, and thank you so much for the work thus far, and I'll see you tomorrow. And I want to turn it now over to Madam Chair.
Can she hear? I don't know if the mic, is the mic close?
Sarah, do you need a motion to adjourn?
Her video is awesome, so I don't know if she's in the room still.
Oh,
Yeah, I think she made the motion.
I'll do it, yeah.
Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Second? Godfrey? All in favor? So moved. Good night. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So these are my meetings.
Place where you can go to, yeah. That's what, you know, I kept my citizenship in Panama for a while. Yeah, the US, at some point,
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by the pound.
even though
Enter your participant ID followed by you are in the meeting now. There are attorneys participating in the meeting.
Eddie, do you like calling being called Ed?
you make up a lot of work.
Is Sarah on yet? Did anyone reach out to Sarah?
I don't know. I have no idea.
knew, I think no one knew it, so maybe it's put it on the map. It was brand new, I mean, really new. That's awesome.
Can you guys reach out, see if you can get in touch with Sarah to see what's going on?
I just text Moira to see if she reached out.
My mom actually, I've never been to Panama, and I told her, she's going to have what we have here without it. Panama, Guatemala, and.
Roger, ready?
We're all ready, just wait to get the show. Alex, the here you wouldn't sheet that thing you sent out for March or whatever. It is what it is.
It's a AFT bigger than
But are they trying to stop things or are they trying
I'm sorry, yeah, I just need to finish it more today.
But it's engineering.